Good morning, everybody. This unit is all about starchy staples. We've already talked about how starch can be stored in the plant, typically in the seed, as a food source for the developing embryo. But actually, starch can be stored in other parts of the plant as well. It can be stored most commonly in underground organs like the roots or stems that are modified in some way to develop underground. Sometimes we'll also see them in leaves. The types of starch that you would see in the plant include amylose, which looks like strings of pearls. Basically, it's just glucose linked together by an alpha bond. And then amylopectin, which is also glucose molecules, but they are in a branched pattern. Glucose molecules that are strung together in alpha bonds as amylose are easier to break down. Amylopectin is a little bit more difficult to break down. And we can see either of these starch sources in the plant. And glycogen there is actually the starch that is stored by humans. So if you were to eat glucose, it can be stored as this glycogen molecule with this very similar structure. Typically, you see that in the muscle or the liver. In addition to it being used as a food source, it can be used for as adhesives, maybe on an envelope or a stamp. They can be used as a filler or coating, or what we call sizing, that can help with preparing fabrics, helping them with adhering the dye to that fabric. In the pharmaceutical industry, you would see them as coverings or coatings or binding. Can also be used as laundry starch in sweeteners that are sugar-based, and it can be fermented with yeast to produce an alcohol. All of the starchy food crops we're going to talk about in this unit come from different plant families, but they have certain common characteristics. One is they're typically found in parts of the plant that are not the seed, and it could be the root, the leaves, or the stem, and they're modified in some way, and typically propagated asexually, taking cuttings. That means that they're easy to reproduce and they can be used widespread in mass in lots of acreage. And they typically are pretty resistant to poor environmental conditions, which is why you see them grown all over the world, even in harsh conditions. And they're grown because they're high in carbohydrate. That's what the starch is. And yet they're low in pretty much everything else, including protein and fat. So if we look at the stem, we know that stem's major role is to transport water and sugar throughout the plant body, as well as absorb minerals. But stems can also be modified. The best example of this is a tuber, and we'll see botanically what a tuber is, but essentially it's a modified stem. Other modified stems include the rhizome and the corm, and we'll talk about the botanical differences between those two, but the three crops that we're going to talk about are ginger, taro, and white potato. So bulbs and corms, they typically from the outside look really similar to each other. The bulb being more familiar probably because you've probably seen a tulip bulb or an onion, but essentially it's a set of stems that are also surrounded by layers of leaves that are modified to be fleshy or papery. So if you look at this diagram here, it looks like these layers of onion leaves, and then this tiny little stem right here called the basal plate, and then a little root mass here. Okay, so onions, lilies, hyacinths. Now the corm looks very similar from the outside, but if you were to split it open inside, you would see there aren't leaves under here. It's mostly starch, and it might be covered in some fleshy scales, but otherwise the inside is pretty much this dense, starchy material. So onions or onion bulb is very popular around the world, thought to originate out of Central Asia, which is now parts of Iran and Pakistan. The Egyptians treasured it for, they believed that eating it would produce strength for those that were building the pyramids. It's really popular in many, many dishes, especially ones that need strong flavors. And we see it in everything from casseroles to quiche to pasta sauce, soups, pizza, or even as on its own, fried or caramelized or sauteed. Just try and think of a meal that doesn't have onions in it. Onions are typically propagated by seed. So if you see this onion growing in the ground, it will produce a flower that you can collect the seeds from, which will allow you to produce many more onions. You can also propagate an onion just by planting the onion underground, and it will sprout, but it will only produce one onion, whereas sexual reproduction will give you many, many seeds. So the corm, like I said, looks really similar to an onion, but if you split it open on the inside, it's really just a stem that is swollen and starchy, and the exterior has these like scaly lead covering. It's mainly just starch though. So cocoa yam or taro, Colocasia esculenta is taro. Thought to have originated in Southeast Asia, and pretty popular in Asian cuisine in tropical areas, even in parts of Africa. It was brought to South America via the slave trade, and it grows really well in moist and wet conditions. In fact, it could even grow in rice paddies, and we'll talk about that in a second. If you split open the corm, you can see that it's mainly white. It's got these little purple flecks in it. Those purple flecks are phenolic pigments, and that is just a result of oxidation. But that's kind of how you know you've got a taro corm. The leaves themselves are quite large and resemble elephant ears. There's another plant that's called elephant ears, and it does actually get propagated via its corms. It's related to it, but it's not a food crop. So production-wise, Nigeria is number one. Like I alluded to, it grows well in rice paddies. It can actually grow alongside rice or lotus. And the plant is actually adapted to be able to withstand being flooded because it has these air spaces in the stem. Taro is also produced in Hawaii, and probably why you might have heard, like, don't step on the taro root. We know it's not actually a root. It's actually a modified stem that we call a corm. But Moana made it popular, so it's okay if Disney kind of got it right. So the corm typically has to be cooked in some way because it has high calcium oxalate crystals that get broken down to calcium that can be absorbed by the body, but if you ate it raw, it wouldn't be good for you. So they're usually fermented or cooked in some way, and it's prepared like potatoes. They can be baked or roasted or boiled or fermented to make a dish called poi. Poi is really this pudding type dish. It's kind of pasty, and it's a little bit purple because of those phenolic compounds. Very popular in Polynesian cuisine. Okay, so the next modified stem is the rhizome, and these are underground horizontal stems that contain starch, and they produce little rootlets off of their rhizomes to help them absorb water, but really the rhizome is a food storage organ. Ginger is the best example of this, and as a food crop, and as a flower crop, iris is a good example of a rhizome. Ginger is Zingiber officinale, and it's prized for its role as a spice and also in folk medicine. Native to China and parts of India, it's made its way through the Mediterranean and into Japan and England in that order, and was brought to the United States as a result of the Spanish. And today, India is the largest producer of ginger, and it's also prized for not only its role as a flavoring agent, but also in medicine. And so there are compounds that are active in helping to quell gastrointestinal problems like nausea. It's also thought to be effective to help with headaches. I can attest to it being a really good anti-nausea agent. You can buy little ginger teas and they're very, very effective. The last group of modified stems are tubers. And these, we said, are full of starch. And in the case of potato, they produce these eyes that each one of them sprouts as a stem and can propagate from there asexually. White potato gets its name because of the interior, not the exterior. The skin of most potatoes are yellow or brown or red, but you can see there's quite a lot of genetic diversity. They are the 5th most important food crop worldwide behind the cereals and sugarcane, and they are originated from probably not a place that you would imagine, Peru. They are part of the Solanaceae family, which includes other members such as tomato and eggplant and pepper, but its family has a set of compounds that are glycoalkaloids, I should say, that can be considered toxic or poisonous. For example, solanine is one of those compounds that can build up in the potato and be used as a defense mechanism, but for people, it can be harmful to your digestive tract. So if you see something in the potato that is green, you want to avoid it. But potatoes go back a long ways, adapted to the conditions of Peru, but actually they're very easy to grow worldwide. And they made their way via the Spanish coming into Peru, and they were brought back to Europe after that took place. Can you imagine European cuisine without potatoes? It's kind of hard to imagine. But potatoes were not in their cuisine until after the 1500s. So Prussia's King Frederick planted potatoes during wartime and encouraged peasants to grow and eat them as a way to help prevent famine. And there was some resistance to eating them because they were concerned that they might be poisonous or cause hallucinations because of their relationship to the Solanaceae family. In fact, though, it is true that the top part of the plant is poisonous, but the tuber is completely fine to eat. Parts of Europe, including Ireland, readily accepted potato as a crop to grow. It became a dietary staple in the Irish diet. They had the best climate conditions and soil that would produce potato very easily, and it could feed a large family. And that was one driver that led to increase in population. And so even if you were poor, you could eat potatoes and milk and sometimes fish or meat and be able to sustain your diet. That is until Phytophthora infestans, otherwise known as late blight of potato, came in. This fungi attacks the leaves and the stems and really retards the growth of the tuber, and it's hard to know it's there until it's already done its damage. It really likes cool and wet weather, and it's easily propagated. It's easily transmitted during propagation. Remember, we said we cut up those potatoes into lots of little pieces, and then we have more Phytophthora. It made its way into Europe in the 1840s and was found in Ireland in 1845. And this led to a huge destruction of the crop and led to famine. Millions died of starvation or from diseases as a result of famine, and this led to a mass immigration of the Irish to the United States. Now, why didn't they choose to grow a different crop? That is a story that we're going to pick up and come back to on Friday as it relates to your reading. But while Ireland was really struggling with this potato fungi, other parts of the world in Europe were also growing this crop, but not having as much difficulty because the blight was not as severe. They also were not heavily relying on it as much for a dietary staple as they were in Ireland. Ultimately, late blight was controlled by a fungicide. Potatoes arrived in the United States via the Bahamas. It was given as a gift to the Virginia colony, and even Thomas Jefferson approved them, and they were readily accepted by the immigrants, the Irish, that had been used to eating them and growing them in Ireland, and when they came to the United States, picked up that tradition again. While we're not a leading producer of potatoes, many regions of the United States grow potatoes, and it's grown mainly in 38 states. And we harvest over 1 million acres of potatoes a year. Mainly propagated by seed, not real seed, but remember we said we cut these potato pieces that contains 2 eyes. We let them superize or heal, and then we plant them again, and that's what seed potatoes are. Again, producing clones of the parent potato. The United States is responsible for 5% of the world's total production. They can be grown in almost every state, even Florida. The main producing states include Idaho, Washington, and Maine. And actually in Maine, they give off for kids to help harvest. It's really a tradition more than actually needing those kids anymore to work as labor, but they still do give off for time in the spring and time in the fall for harvest. Much of the potatoes that are produced in the United States are for fresh. The rest is for processing, whether it's fries or chips or potato flakes or starch. Lay's potatoes, they grow in the southeast, like Florida, at one part of the year, and then in Idaho at another part of the year, Washington another different part of the year, to make sure they have enough potatoes for their chips, for the chip industry. There are 4 major cultivars or types of potatoes. The round white, which has a pretty decent skin. It's kind of the all-purpose potato. It's good for everything from baking to boiling or processing, flaking, frying. Then you have the russets, those long cylindrical, rusty, corky colored skin that is really good for baking and makes for excellent French fries. And then the round reds and long whites, which have a really thin skin that are good for mashing or smashing. Can you also think back to a time when maybe a family member or a parent said, you should eat the skin on the potato? That is true, because the exterior skin has a lot of nutrition in it, whereas the inside is mostly starch and water. I can't think of a culture that doesn't highlight potatoes in some way, whether it's in Jewish tradition to make latke pancakes, or in Russian borscht, or mashed potatoes, or adding cheese in our gratin. Really, it's pretty popular in almost any cuisine today. Okay, we're going to pick up next time and talk about true root crops.